All right, we're back with Dr. Andrea for the second part of my conversation with her. Welcome back, Dr. Andrea.
Thank you, Harini.
So, we'll be starting off sort of where we left off, but I want to sort of start this part of our conversation off with talking about the work that you've done with curriculum. Because so far we've talked about, schools, nonprofits, students, but you've also led, through your work as an education consultant as well, curriculum redesigns and professional development that's rooted in expanding access for, like we discussed, all learners.
Hmm.
But what are some pitfalls you've seen in this line of work, and really what helps these teams and institutions move past almost performative change into real solutions for real learners?
Sure. I think one of the pitfalls is making assumptions about what educators know. And I think that is in any teaching and learning environment. So, whether it is your traditional K 12 system, whether it's in a nonprofit setting, the staff that are working with youth, and a lot of times the assumption is that they know certain things, that they know adolescent development and psychology, that they understand standards alignment, that they understand the difference between a formal and an informal assessment. There are a lot of assumptions that are just made that are completely wrong, and we need to invest at a ground level in what teachers actually know. And I use teachers in a way, I like to say educators sometimes, because then that encompasses people that are outside of traditional classroom settings. So what an educator knows about their learner, about pacing, about materials. So, curriculum a lot of times is seen as being the books that we use. Well, curriculum is anything that you use for teaching and learning. So, is it multimedia? Is it project based? Is it inquiry based? Is it self paced? So you have a lot of folks that are like, well, it's an online program, so that must mean that they know how to like go through it, and that's not the case. We have a lot of credit recovery programs in a lot of high schools now, and they just kind of put people in front of the computers and they make assumptions about what they know. And so I think that we really need to start breaking down to the bare bones of what is it that we're really trying to accomplish with. And that could be with youth, again, that could be with adults, but what is it ultimately that we want the outcomes to be? And then kind of backwards map. And so I do that in my work, the backwards mapping. So what I would prefer is that a school or nonprofit work with me for an entire programmatic year and not like a one off, because the one offs are always so out of context and you really don't get to know a community that way. I like to really dig in, talk to the leaders, talk to all the folks that are invested in the process. That could be curriculum coordinators, that could be team leads, that could be youth workers and staff, board members, anybody that's a partner with the organization, and kind of start digging down with lots of questions about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and then work backwards from having the end in mind. If you want them to have this set of outcomes, then how do we backwards map and pace it out so that it makes sense? Um, it's the same way that you would do with this, like thinking about who makes textbooks. A lot of times they pace it out based on the number of instructional days. And so we don't want to go in and do it that kind of formally, but we do want to say, based on the amount of time that you have, let's just say I was working with a arts based mentoring program right here in Chicago, and we were like, well, how many hours are you going to actually see them for? Okay, well, we added it up and it was a total of about 6 to 10 hours. Okay, so what can you realistically do with them in that time? and then realized that we were being too lofty with some of the kind of goals, paring back a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
then realizing that whoever was going to actually deliver the curriculum also needed their own set of training materials. So almost like a curriculum for the facilitator so that they can know how to approach certain conversations. You might think a conversation about, let me just think about one of the topics that came up. Let's just say about dating. You might
Mm-hmm.
think, oh, this is just a pretty, we could just talk about dating, but what if someone is experiencing dating violence? What if someone is in a home where the mom is in an abusive relationship? So you're assuming that everybody's having these positive feelings about this based on what your background has been and what cultural context you bring. So a lot of what we do is bringing that equity piece into it. Think about the continuum, the spectrum that all of these kids are bringing to the table, that some of them are, you might be the first person. I used to tell teachers this all the time when I would do my professional development. You might be the first person that they see in the morning that's not yelling at them.
Mm.
So just try to be like not a person that yells at them. That's
Yeah,
the
fair
like
enough.
that's goal number one, because you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You're making an assumption based on either how you grew up, maybe in a middle class family. You grew up a certain way, having certain values, morals. You grew up with a certain level of supervision, and some of the kids in front of you are not getting that kind of supervision. Their person is working so much that they're not there in the morning or at night when they go to bed. You don't know if they have housing instability. You don't know if they're hungry, and that makes a difference in terms of whether I don't want to learn anything about geometry if I'm starving, or if my parents had a fight and my mom is crying before school. Like all of these things that people bring to the table, that's a part of the equity conversation, and learning how to have empathy for who's showing up in front of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you definitely touched on this a little bit, but building off on that same line of discussion, what does it mean to prepare these educators for classrooms and students that are increasingly, I guess the best way to put this would be experientially diverse, whether
Mhm.
that's in terms of cultural contexts, community contexts, or even linguistic contexts. Because, of course, like the work that I do here is about helping students see themselves through even standardized education in terms of understanding the linguistics of it. Because
Mhm.
we see learners that, I mean, from different cultures, a lot of them are multilingual
Mhm.
and have that portion as well. So, really, what does it mean to prepare these educators for such classrooms, and how do you really emphasize that as an education consultant?
Sure. I think in an ideal situation, you would have a leader in the building, whether that be a principal or in some cases, even depending on the size of the school, sometimes you have access to the principal. Other times you have access to maybe like an assistant principal of curriculum and instruction, or there will be team leads, and they will either be like content area based or grade level based. But in general, you would try to work with some set of leaders, right? That who were able to say, somebody that has some sort of influence over how things are run in a school. So that's your first kind of line of attack. But I would even say, again, not making those assumptions, having taught pre service teachers in undergrad as part of my former experience, again, not making those assumptions because some of them wanted to shut down the conversations about just even multiculturalism by saying, I don't see color. I just don't see it. It's not an issue. So we can move on to the next topic. And it's like, well, no, unless you're literally legally blind, you do see color. Now, do you act on it in a negative way when you see that somebody's from a different culture, that's two completely different conversations. But you can see that someone physically is different than you. And that's okay. Like, we can't shut the conversation down at what you don't see, you see. So now what does that mean? You've got to now challenge yourself in your own set of assumptions and predispositions and stereotypes even about what you thought about certain communities, certain schools, the way that folks learn, so that you could be a great teacher. A great teacher has to take into account all of these individual differences, and you can use those towards your benefit as long as you don't see it as a deficit. The fact that you're even bringing up like multilingualism, there is an opportunity for showing students that, hey, the more languages you know, the better, actually. And let's talk about some reasons why we don't embrace all languages. And again, it has to be appropriate. A kindergarten conversation is going to be much different than a conversation with middle school versus high school. So I get that.
Absolutely.
But it does have to start at a willingness and an openness to what's really in front of you, not shutting down and not saying, well, that's not an issue for me. Or I had some students who would say, well, you know what? I'm from a rural community. I never saw African American or Hispanic people until I came to the Chicagoland area. I've never had an African American teacher until you. And I would be like, huh, interesting. So, you know, and I'm going to go back after I get my degree. I'm going to go back to my rural community where everybody's going to look like me. So honestly, I really don't have to embrace all of these things. I really don't have to talk about these very uncomfortable, difficult conversations. And I would always push them again. The history of America is about movement. People move all the time. People immigrate, people move across country. And if somebody gets a job in one community and they say, oh, this place is hiring, and now their family members are coming and cousins, and now all of a sudden you're shifting demographic patterns. And that's okay. That is the story of humans, is about movement. And so you have to be open to the fact that even your community could look different in 5 or 10 years, and you want to be prepared for that by bringing in that empathy that I mentioned before. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's definitely also about helping those educators as well understand that through your work, and I definitely see the need for that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And so we talked a little bit about digital learning and
Hmm.
addressing, like you mentioned as well, from our first conversation to this one, we've talked a little bit about the almost the discrepancies in
Hmm.
accessibility to digital learning as well. So how has the shift to digital learning, has it widened or narrowed opportunity gaps? And what do educators really need to be doing differently about it now to understand how it can help students best?
Yes. So I think probably during COVID, as soon as COVID hit, we really started to see where those gaps were and realized just how big they were. A lot of students in the communities that I've worked with, they have phones. Um, Sometimes they have service, sometimes they don't, but they have phones, most of them. What they didn't have was computers at home. And so a lot of them would be in their classes, and I would see them doing like this. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm trying to edit my paper before I turn it in. And I'm like, on your phone? Well, yeah, I had to do it on my phone. And I'm just like, ay, ay, ay. So, first of all, the persistence for a kid to do some sort of assignment on their phone, um, hello, that's huge. But they shouldn't
Yeah.
have to do that. And I think once COVID hit and people realized, oh, we have to give them computers if we want them to be able to access online learning. So that was like the first leveler, I think. Then the next realization was there were kids, even in the news. I remember seeing news stories about kids going with their families in cars to like McDonald's parking lots so they could get internet access to do the online learning. So then that was like the next thing was like, oh, internet costs. And we are making some assumptions that everybody just has internet.
Yeah.
So then I know for sure there was one company that gave like 9.95 a month for internet if you had some low income markers of what assistance you were getting. So that helped in some cases. I think where we are now with it is, especially as we're moving towards more technology, more AI tools, um, the the divide is really coming more so in my opinion, with teacher preparation. And
Mm.
so you have teachers that are in the more resource schools that are getting the training, that are getting their computers are already loaded up with the latest whatever and apps to help them and help their jobs be easier and so on and so forth. And then you have in the most under resourced schools, the teachers tend to not have the same level of certifications, tend to teach out of licensure more. So what that means is I may need a teacher that teaches algebra 1 and 2 and geometry, but I'm having a problem finding somebody that has that exact licensure. So then I'll hire somebody who either has maybe middle school math, or I'll hire a computer teacher. Like this is like a real story. I'll hire a computer teacher, and that teacher then has to teach math. Well, that's not who you need in front of kids teaching math. So you have a lot of those situations still in, I would say we call them like difficult to staff schools. And the first thing you're going to have a problem with is math teachers, special ed teachers, science teachers, all of those sort of folks that there tend to be shortages anyway. But as we are seeing more and more like distance between the affluent and the middle school kind of schools and schools that are not there, you really just see how the preparation of their teachers is lopsided as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's definitely a lens to look through educational work as well, because you've talked about the work that you do with at the school level, at the institution and community level, but also working with these educators, because working
Mm-hmm.
with educators is also seems like a foundational step in that
Yes.
institutional change that we discussed.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And you yourself have experience, teaching and working on everything from the foundations to education to multicultural pedagogy, like we discussed, to the very philosophy of education.
Mm-hmm.
So which ideas from those courses have stuck with you the most in this work that, you think that people working in education or who hope to work in education should take with them?
That's a great question. I would say there was a specific program that I taught in, and it was um, a program, it was like an interdisciplinary graduate level program. And it was basically created to be an alternative to a traditional graduate school program in education. So they drew in a lot of educators who would not necessarily do well in a traditional grad school setting. They were existing teachers. A lot of them were teachers in under resourced communities and schools. And my job was not like a traditional professor. I was more of a facilitator of learning, and I built the curriculum as the course progressed. And it was simultaneously the hardest the hardest role I've had, but also the most rewarding, because I
Mm.
swear I just couldn't wrap my brain around, what do you mean there's no book to teach from? And they were like, no, it's no book. I'm like, okay, is there a syllabus? And they were like, no, the syllabus is based upon you and your students. And I was like, so how do you know who gets an A? And they were like, everybody gets an A. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. And they were like, basically, unless you're having some serious attendance problem, which we'll address in a different way, they were just basically like, trust us, this is going to work. So I'm doing the work and we are building the curriculum together. So we would have conversations. Um, I would give them some prompt or something, and we would have robust conversation about, well, who even created the bell schedule anyway? And then I would say, I don't know. That's a good question. Let's go off and do some research, and we'll come back next week and talk about it more. And so then we would bring in our research, and then that would lead to, oh wow, who Carnegie? Like, where did that even come from, and who's funding? And so all of these conversations are then what would lead, and I would go out and find movies that in education that had something to do with what we were talking about, and they even were like, well, how do I know if I'm doing well? And I'm like, well, you get an A. And they're like, just automatically. I had the best attendance in that class of any class I've ever taught in life,
Mm-hmm.
because the assumption was you are empowered as a learner. I trust that you're going to be here to get the content. They would get there before I would get there. Like they would be there like ready to go. Like, and it was a 3-hour course,
Mm-hmm.
like 6 to 9 p.m. during the week. And they were all practicing teachers. And they would be there early and they would stay late and they would email in between. And it was by far one of the best experiences that I've had. So I think the one thing that I've learned from that is that people will learn regardless of whether there's a formal teacher that's like imparting the wisdom in their heads. People are curious by nature, and unless you shut that down, it's natural to want to know what's going on in the world around you. Yeah.
And yeah, that sounds like a wonderful experience, and it's definitely something that I can tell that your students in that course and that you have in common, and of course I do as well, is that passion for the
Yes.
work. And from this conversation and from getting to talk to you about all the wonderful work and the impact that you have in
Mhm.
education, it's clear that that's a really great starting point for anyone who's interested in working in education, to have that passion and
Yes.
and to want to see that change.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's something, it's hard to measure, but it's one of those things that if you know you know what that feeling is of being being so earnest to learn more about a particular topic or an area. And
Hmm.
once you start to feel like sort of that energy swelling up around an area, I think, especially as a young person, and I do appreciate the fact that you are amongst the youth and you are already thinking about these sorts of issues already. And I
For
think
sure.
that a lot more young people can be empowered and advocate for not just themselves but for others. This whole idea again of having empathy and knowing that even if I do have a certain level of privilege, and I'll put that in quotes because it's all relative, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, if you have sometimes people will say things like, oh, that's a first world problem, like Starbucks not having your particular matcha latte or something. That it is, it's a privilege because there's some people that don't have running water, or they don't know if their school is going
Absolutely.
to open from day to day because electricity is sketchy where they live. All of those sorts of things that we just don't have to worry about. um, Once you start to find out where your passion lies as a young person, and you start to realize that I can actually have an impact in some area regardless of where I'm situated, I think that is it becomes beneficial to your community, and really can have a global consequences depending, just who you get behind you, who your like-minded team of people are. So,
For sure. And that is the end of our conversation. But Dr. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your invaluable insights in this field. I know that you have, so much credentials behind you and so many achievements in this field, but it's truly a pleasure to have you and to get to pick your brain on working at education. So thank you so much
yes.
for being here.
No problems, no problems. Thank you again, Harini.
Of course.